Hi, and welcome to this lecture on working with themes, narrative gaps, blind spots, and creating hope. Before we get into the use of these particular skills, it's important to cover the fundamentals of counselling that you should have already learned by now. These general counselling skills enable you to build, first of all, rapport, and then a therapeutic relationship by holding your client. The fundamentals are non-judgment, accepting your client exactly as they are, active listening, which means actually being involved and engaged in the client's story. I often refer to this as listening with our mouth. So instead of just listening with our ears, we're listening with our mouth. So everything we're hearing, we're repeating back. We do this by reflecting content and feelings, paraphrasing, and summarising. I also recommend the use of parroting, the occasional one-word reflection of an important word that the client has just used. We ask open-ended questions, very open-ended, the more open the better, and we always communicate empathy. And empathy sounds like, when talking to a client, usually sounds like, so you feel, and when you do, you feel like this. Very much emphasising the role of the client in their own story. So what we're talking about today when working with themes, narrative gaps, blind spots, and even hope is about the concept of encounter. Encounter occurs between a counsellor and a client when a theme or a part of the client's story is brought into their here and now awareness. And these encounters are usually with old and dismembered, as opposed to remembered, parts of the client's self or their story that they don't want to think about, that they have probably worked hard and probably had very good reasons for not paying attention to, perhaps for many, many years. What tends to happen is that we have experiences in our lives that we can't quite make sense of, that don't fit, or that we're simply powerless to do anything about. And so we find ways of dealing with these difficult feelings. Sometimes we put them away, we stuff them down, we disown them, we make them somebody else's feelings. So as the counsellor, it's our job to create a strong and trusting therapeutic relationship. Now people think or like to say, that takes a few sessions, we can't do that in one session. No, it's not true. That strong, trusted therapeutic relationship can be built in just a few minutes. And a lot of the skills that you learned in Counselling Skills 1 are all about developing that therapeutic relationship. And the counselling fundamentals on the previous slide will also help you build that therapeutic relationship. Because the role of the counsellor is to be able to hold the client during the encounter with him or herself. It's the role of the counsellor to provide a gentle honesty in which the counsellor neither gives in to the client nor attacks him or her, neither flees nor fights. So you can hear that idea of holding there as having a double meaning. Holding of the client, like you might hold a baby gently, not too tight but not too loose, and also holding yourself steady in the face of the client's difficulties. So what we're talking about is we're talking about identifying themes in the client's narrative, identifying gaps in the client's narrative, and identifying blind spots in the client's narrative. A narrative gap is simply when we become aware that there's something missing, or that there has been up until a particular moment in the counselling an element in the story missing. An example is when a client has been talking perhaps for some time about herself and then mentions that she's got a sister. And it's like, oh, hang on a second, it sounded like you were just an only child and now you're talking about having a sister. So tell me about your sister, what's significant about your sister, or what is it about your sister that you haven't mentioned her up until now? For a counsellor, we'll often be aware of hearing a story and thinking to ourselves, there's something missing. This all doesn't quite fit together in a neat and tidy way. I wonder what it is. Identifying themes is very much about summarising. When summarising, it's important to be open to encourage a lot of detail, to give the client's story back. I often say to students, can you give the client's story back to them, putting the client in the middle of the story and give them more detail than the client gave you. It sounds like, oh, won't that take forever? It never does. And it's quite okay for the counsellor to take up 40 to 50% of the space in the counselling session if that time is spent focusing on the client's experience. So when summarising, give as much detail, if not more detail, than the client's given you. Because often we've seen things in the client as they're telling the story that they're not aware of in themselves, and so we can add that to our summaries. When we're identifying themes, we're just selecting aspects of the story that seem possibly thematic, and we coherently re-represent them back to the client. So you were talking about, so I've just noticed in terms of bringing that narrative gap. So now we're talking about your sister and the difficult relationship that you had with your sister. And I remember over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the difficulties you have in your social groups when you feel that you're, just when you feel like you're getting close to a female friend or a female colleague at work, suddenly something seems to happen and you get concerned and anxious about that relationship. Is there a theme there? Is there a connection between how you feel with your sister and how you feel with the other women in these situations? Blind spots. Blind spots is anything that we fail to see or that we choose to ignore that will keep us from identifying and managing problem situations or identifying and developing new opportunities. So what is it that we're not seeing? And often we'll simply name, the counsellor will simply name what otherwise appears to be absent from the client's consideration. We can name it or we can ask open questions. Open questions like, what problems are you avoiding? What opportunities are you ignoring? What's really going on for you in this situation? What are you overlooking? What do you refuse to see? What action are you avoiding? What assumptions are you making? What other factors are you failing to acknowledge as you're talking about this? Are you really being honest with yourself? What's underneath this situation for you? What's driving the significance of this situation for you? And sometimes we might say, if others were really honest with you, what do you think that they might tell you about you in this situation? The other element of blind spots is to encourage a reflection on another person's perspective in the situation. So what do you think your boss's role might be in this situation at work? And what about the colleague that you're having trouble with? What do you imagine they're wanting out of this situation that you've been describing? So that's narrative gaps, themes, and blind spots as types of encounters when we're presenting the client with something that's difficult for them to hear and take in. Hope is like the other side of the encounter coin. Hope can give the client and the counsellor the courage sometimes that they require in order to facilitate and experience the intensity of an encounter. Hope has been found to be a common factor in clients' positive experiences of counselling, and so is increasingly becoming a mainstay or essential theme in counselling. Many people seem to have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to hope. I say this because often students that I'm teaching, usually there'll be maybe 3 or 4 in a group of 15 who say, oh, I don't believe in hope, or hope makes me feel kind of icky. So it's important just to find your own word around what this is. And the definition by Stevenson, 1991, I think is a good one. Hope is the interaction of thinking, acting, feeling, and relating. So thinking, doing, feeling, and relating or engaging with other people in the world that is directed towards a future fulfillment that is personally meaningful. So it's personally meaningful, and at the same time it's also uncertain. It's almost the definition of future, isn't it? Uncertain. So it's uncertain, but it's personally meaningful, and it's located in the future. And our actions, our thoughts, our actions, our feelings, and our relationships now are directed towards that future fulfillment. That is hope. Hope is something that we feel. It's embodied. It's corporeal. Where do you feel hope? How do you feel hope? And my experience is that this isn't necessarily a common way of feeling it. People have all sorts of metaphors and ways of thinking about hope. But the important part is if you're going to hold hope as a counsellor, thinking, acting, feeling and relating towards a future fulfillment that's personally meaningful, how do you feel it? Where do you feel it? How do you hold hope with the client? So I've got the existential view there, which is kind of my main approach as a counsellor. And hope is when anxiety begins to transform into excitement. Okay, so some of the benefits of hope. So people with hope tend to have a greater number of goals. They have more difficult goals. They have more success at achieving their goals. They perceive their goals as challenges to be overcome. They have greater happiness and less distress. They have superior coping skills. They recover better from physical injury, and they report less burnout at work. And there's a whole range of other benefits that have been identified and described of people who have hope. How do we create and cultivate hope in the counselling relationship? So this is from Larson and Steege, 2012. And there are client accounts of hope in early counselling sessions, which was a qualitative study. So cultivating hope is about demonstrating and communicating hope and hopefulness. So think about that, thoughts about, feelings about, and a relatedness towards a meaningful future. How do you demonstrate that? Thinking about, feeling, and relating towards a meaningful future. Maintaining a focus on the client's own personal meaning. Attending directly to the counselling relationship, what's happening in the here and now, or what has been happening between the counsellor and the client, and what's likely to happen or what is wanted or hoped for between the counsellor and client going into the future. And exploring goals on the basis of past accomplishments. So looking forwards to the future, looking at future goals, and then reflecting on what the client's already achieved. Interventions that the counsellor can employ as supporting the therapeutic relationship, sometimes by witnessing client hopelessness. Simply by being willing to reflect. I can see that you really feel hopeless and helpless right now. And being able to sit with that goes back to the client's ability to neither flee nor intervene, to simply be there with the client. And then to highlight client resources, not in a very active way, which can sometimes seem patronising, but in a way that's as a client's talking, to simply say, oh, look at that, look what you've done. How did you manage that? Isn't that interesting? We'll talk about that in future weeks when we talk about celebrating with the client. We can use perspective change interventions, which also foster hope. The use of reframes, the use of metaphor to develop a different future, the use of externalizing, which we'll also look at in future lectures, and the use of humour. Sometimes it can be really helpful to find a way of joking about things. Safety, non-judgment and acceptance gives the client hope that they can be accepted and understood. So if the counsellor is willing to accept and understand the client, then maybe the client can accept and understand themselves. And the counsellor's engagement with the work, just by having a hopeful energy, begins to foster hope. There's some hope fostering interventions. So I'm running out of time to talk about. Interventions to leave the client feelings of, I can do this, I am capable, my situation is temporary. Self-awareness that identifies their values and hopes. Focusing on the client's worthiness and communicating just by our very being that we see the client as having worth, the client is worth helping. Offering perspective changes, just like the identifying the themes, the narrative gaps and the blind spots, those all foster hope. And providing a future focus, so to move from exploration of themes to, so what would you like to come from this? Even if the client can't see possibilities, it's important for the counsellor to feel that hope for the future, and then to be able to look at what threatens that hope. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, and see you next time.